My name is Valerie, and my sister is Vivian. This story happened years ago, back when we were still children. We had moved into our godparents' house that summer. Our parents had decided to do some renovations and wanted us to get better acquainted with that part of the family. They were pretty well off, so it was more like a mansion than a house. Vivian and I's room was on the left side of the mansion. You could tell just from the outside that it was updated more than the other half. Our room was located on the very top floor, and our godparents' room was a door down from us. They made sure we had everything, so we really didn't have to go very far. But if we did, my sister and I both had to go together. They had a couple co-workers here and there that knew the house like the back of their hand, so if we strayed too far, someone would still be able to find us. We created a lot of great memories that summer, but there were a couple ones that stood out the most to us, and one, in particular, was the most terrifying. Recalling the first incident, it was a normal day like any other. We had spent a pretty good amount of time outside, so when we came back in, we only had enough energy to eat and go directly to bed. That night, I woke up to my godmother shaking me awake, asking if I had seen Vivian. Confused and still groggy, it didn't make much sense what she was asking until I sat up and Vivian wasn't in her bed. We made a makeshift search party and branched out to look for her. I remember being so scared. It was a huge place, and not only was it the house we had to search, it was the grounds outside too, all at the dead of night. They had a good outstretch of land behind the house that led into a forest. I could tell the more the night went on, the more desperate everyone got. Around 2 a.m., Vivian was found on the opposite side of the house, sleeping in one of the abandoned rooms. I had fallen asleep before they found her. I remember it being so strange. It was unlike her to ever sleepwalk. Once Vivian woke up the next morning, both our godparents told us both that it was probably because of the changing of the environment. It only happened one other time, but she was found at the edge of the forest. Luckily, they caught her before she walked in. As horrifying as that sounds, it got much worse. It again was a normal night. We had stayed up a little later to watch a couple movies, but that night I had nightmares. Most of them consisted of me being on the rundown side of the mansion, running down each hallway calling for Vivian. They were all so vivid, I still remember them to this day, but I woke up shaking. I looked to my left, and Vivian was in her bed next to me. I felt relieved after the last two incidents, but I noticed that she looked to be wide awake. I called her name quietly and told her I had a bad dream. Her eyes flickered towards me for a second, but she didn't move or say anything. I called her name again, but she still didn't move. Her eyes were focused on the front of the room. I got up and walked over to her, and as soon as I got close enough, I realized that she was crying. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes again were focused on only one part of the room. Without really knowing what to do, I started screaming her name and shaking her violently. A couple seconds later, she made this huge gasp and sat up straight, tucking her knees into her chest and taking big breaths. I asked what was wrong with her, and it took her a while to answer me. She had her hands covering her face now and was rocking back and forth. Me not knowing what to do, I climbed into bed with her and pulled her in for a tight hug. When she finally caught her breath, she said that she saw something standing in the corner of our room. She told me she had woken up and saw it, but tried moving and couldn't. This figure, which at first had been still, began moving and contorting its body. At one point, bending completely backwards. I didn't understand. I hadn't seen anything. She said that she was trying not to scare me, but she knew exactly what she saw. Its body still contorting, she could see out of the corner of her eye me walking towards her, and she got scared that it was going to come for me. She tried screaming and tried to push me away, but still couldn't move. It was only when I started shaking her that the figure slowly dissipated, and she was able to move again. None of it made any sense to me in my 10-year-old mind, but she looked clearly distressed. We held on to one another for a long time, and then we both made a point of turning on all the lights in our room. We stayed up the rest of the night together, huddled in her bed. The day that followed after was normal, at least for me. As time went on, I could tell that Vivian hadn't been sleeping. Bags had been forming under her eyes, and she would stay up most nights again with all the lights on. It made it hard to sleep most nights, which I told her. We got into a big argument over it, probably one of the biggest we've ever had before. As an adult now, I can admit I didn't consider how she was feeling, and she gave up trying to argue with me in the middle of it, and told me that night she would keep the lights off, and whatever happened to her, it was on me. Hurt by her words, I ignored her until I went to sleep. As she promised, she kept all the lights off, even my nightlight, which I thought was overkill and was her just being petty. But because it was dark, I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up I don't know how long later to her screaming at the top of her lungs. I'll never forget her screams. They were blood-curdling and made every hair on me stand up. I remember my godparents came running in yelling. I sat up rubbing my eyes looking over at her, who looked utterly horrified. I asked her what was wrong, and she started screaming at me, telling me that it was my fault that I didn't want the lights on. My godfather tried calming her down and was able to eventually, but in the midst of my godfather talking her down, she was hollering about what she had seen. Again, the figure had shown up in the corner of our room, contorting. Not knowing what to do, she had shut her eyes, hoping that when she opened them again, it would be gone. But when she opened them, it was directly in her face. Seeing the fear come over both of my godparents' face while listening to my sister gave me so much anxiety. Even though I believe Vivian, I still honestly didn't know what was going on. I had never heard of this so-called sleep paralysis before, and I wasn't awake that time, so I'm not sure what she saw. But my godmother explained that what she was experiencing was again sleep paralysis, and offered for both of us to stay in their room, which we both happily obliged. I kept apologizing to her over and over again, because even though I didn't understand, it rattled me to see my sister be so afraid. Because my adrenaline was running so high, I had a hard time sleeping the rest of that night. My godparents made sure to leave a couple lights on in their room for us, and even leaving the TV on for some background noise. I stayed up watching TV, but Vivian fell asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow, exhausted from that night and probably all the other nights she stayed up afraid. We stayed in our godparents' room every night that week, but eventually we both started to feel guilty about taking over their room and decided to move back into our old room. We had 2 weeks left of summer break and wanted our godparents to be able to spend it together. So the next night, we both moved back into our room. This night was a night I'd never forget. We both stayed up for a while talking to one another. Vivian made it a point to keep a cross in the bed with her. She said my godmother told her it would help. We both fell asleep shortly after. Then I woke up. I blinked a couple of times, getting the sleep out of my eye, and the room came into focus. I had been sleeping really heavily, so I wasn't sure at the time what woke me up, until I saw it. There was something crouched in the corner of the room. Instinctively, I went to move, but couldn't, and I immediately began to panic. Without warning, it came plunging directly towards me, and the most shocking and gut-wrenching part of it was that I could hear each movement. The last image I remember before seemingly passing out was it right next to my bed, and even though I was terrified, I'm honestly glad I passed out when I did. I didn't want to see what would have happened if I would have remained conscious. Because I hadn't screamed or anything, Vivian and no one in the house knew what I had just witnessed, or the fact that I was passed out at this point. But to Vivian, of course, it just looked as if I was sleeping. After I woke up the next morning, I raced out the room into my godparents' room, telling them what happened. Not knowing what to do, they called our parents and told them that they didn't think it was a good idea for us to stay there anymore, for our safety. After a lot of conversations with both my parents and godparents, they decided to move us into a hotel that was closer to our home. Before I ran out the room, Vivian was just waking up, and again she looked as if she hadn't slept. It was only when we were packing our bags that she told me what she had seen that same night. She had woken up again, not being able to move, but this time she hadn't seen anything. Relieved, she laid there for a second, staring up at the room, when she looked over at me and saw the figure again, crouched directly over top of me in the bed. The cross she had fallen asleep with in her hand, and she began to pray over and over again with her eyes shut. When she opened her eyes again a couple minutes later, it was gone. It's something we don't talk about often, honestly, because it was an equally scary experience for both of us. So, this sleep paralysis story is actually my own personal experience. It's a pretty short one, but I decided to include it anyway, so here we go. The night that this happened, I was talking to my little sister, nephew, and a couple of my friends. We all were swapping sleep paralysis stories. Most of their experiences, if not all of them, they all claimed they saw something, a figure or some type of being or creature. Now, I've had sleep paralysis a couple times in my life, but I've never seen anything. I just was never able to move. This night was similar to all the other experiences I had. I was laying down next to my husband, and I had just drifted off to sleep when I woke up suddenly. We have a charging station next to our TV that leaves a faint glow in the room. I know I couldn't move, but wasn't really worried about it. I remember feeling incredibly drowsy, though. Like the type of drowsy where you can barely keep your eyes open. So I tried to fall back asleep, when I started to hear these voices all at once. They started off faint, and then slowly got louder and louder. It sounded like they were coming from the back door, which was a room back from our bedroom. All these voices were talking at once. Me afraid that someone had broken in, I tried to get up. We keep a shotgun laying a couple feet from our bed, but I couldn't move. The way that I was laying, I couldn't tell if my husband was awake or not, and I was trying my best to wiggle or move to get his attention, but couldn't. The drowsiness was unbearable. I was fighting to keep my eyes open now when it dawned on me that my eyes were actually closed. I could feel them. I know it doesn't make much sense, but I could still see the room very clearly, just now aware that my eyes were shut the entire time. At this point, the voices were getting louder, and I could now hear bumps and thumps. Terrified that we had a break-in, I started trying to wiggle vigorously, trying to get my husband's attention, but I really couldn't move. Getting scared that somebody was going to come around the corner, I tried as hard as I could to move, and somehow was able to lift my arm up enough and hit the headboard. My husband, who I now realized had been awake the entire time, asked me why I had just randomly hit the headboard. Slowly I was able to move again, and I told him what happened, which he replied that he hadn't heard anything. I grabbed my phone to check our cameras, and I didn't see anyone or anything, and he claimed that he never even saw me move. The only time he did was when I hit the headboard. It's something that's not necessarily scary to me. Well, I guess feeling like somebody was in my house was scary, but it was one of my most unusual sleep paralysis experiences to date. A lot of things don't make sense either, like I could see the room but I could feel my eyes closed, or the excessive drowsiness. If anybody else has something similar to that has happened to them, please let me know. My husband and I moved into our house about 2 months ago. Mind you, the house is not completely finished. There's a couple of rooms that need renovating, but we were still able to move in fairly quickly. The first night we moved in, we didn't have any doors up in the house. I need background noise to go to sleep, so we watched movies most of that night. But the only movies I had at hand were, unfortunately, all horror. I say unfortunately because my husband falls asleep rather quick, so eventually I was up and awake by myself. It's much different when you watch a horror movie in the comfort of your own room, cozy in bed with a good snack and your door shut, than in a room that has no doors, and pitch black outside of the room that you're in. And, to top it all off, I'm scared of the dark. Fast forward to about 3 a.m., I fell asleep. When I woke up, I couldn't move. I knew immediately it was sleep paralysis and tried to calm myself. I opened my eyes, and as they came into focus in the room, I saw someone standing at the entrance to our bedroom door. The last movie that we had watched was Quarantine, and it was in the main menu again, playing clips back to back of the movie, so there was a faint glow in the room enough for me to see whoever this was. I immediately tried getting up but couldn't. Looking over at my husband and trying with all my might to move to get him to wake up. It was motionless, but I noticed as I blinked it got closer and closer. Terrified, I tried keeping my eyes open, in my mind thinking that if I did, it would go away. but it moved slowly to the end of the bed. My eyes were getting dry and I had to blink. When I opened them again, to my terror, it was directly in my face. I could feel breath on my cheeks. The smell was so foul that I began to gag. And from the noises I was making, my husband woke up, shaking me and asking if I was okay. The moment I felt my body unfreeze, I rolled over and threw up my dinner. After that, it took me a long time to fall asleep in that house peacefully.